Okay, grades 8. This is grade 8 review of chapter 4. These are 9 questions. These are 9 questions you will see on your final test. The first 3 questions come from 4.1. The next question comes from 4.2, and so on and so forth for 4.3 and 4.4. So the first 3 questions give you a hundreds grid and ask you to interpret the images as percentages. So the first question gives you 100 in the first one and 30 in the other. So if we're thinking about gas tanks, which we have been on the whole unit, this is a full gas tank, which is 100%. That's why there's 100 of the 100 shaded in. And there's an additional 30 out of 100 shaded in the other. So technically, if you put, 30%, not 30 of 100, 30% of the other tank. So if you put these together, there's 130% in total. Or another way to think of it, there's one tank and 30 hundredths of a tank as well. So 130%, or 1 and 3 30 hundredths, or 1 and 3/10ths of a tank full. The second question asks you to interpret this picture and ignore that one in the corner. So there are 24 units in the original tank shaded in, which means it's 24% and a bit more. This bit more over here is what you can't really see in here, but in that little area we have that little yellow dot. And that would be, I'm going to write it as a fraction first, 24 and an additional 5 hundredths of a tank. So as a percent, that would be 24 and 5 hundredths of a percent. Or another way to write that is 24 and, if we think about 5 hundredths as a decimal, it's 5 hundredths. So it's 24 and 5 hundredths percent. Or if we wanted to actually express 5 hundredths in lowest terms, we could divide by 5 and give you 1/20th. So there are 3 acceptable answers for what this is a percent. For the most part, people probably wrote this one here. But in addition to that one, you probably could have written this one because that's easy. And if you were real bright, you probably wrote it as 24 and 1/20th. And your last question that deals with finding percents of tanks. So this one here almost is empty. There's less than a percent in the tank. So we know that there is less than 1% in the tank. And if I magnified this little square here, I see that there's only one dot out of all 100. So really, this is 1/100th of a percent, or 1/100th of a percent. Okay, so there's not much there in that tank at all. There's very little in that tank. Not very far. The fourth question gives you this table, and I'll group it together so I can make more space. It asks you to fill in the information. So the first fraction is 3 out of 20. Now, obviously, we all know that the easiest way to change a fraction to a decimal is to take 3 and divide it by 20 with a calculator. Okay? So 3, divided by 20 is one way we can change it to a decimal. When we press equals, we get 0.15. But sometimes when we don't have a calculator, that option is not given to us. So what we have to be comfortable of doing is realizing that 3 over 20 can be changed into an equivalent fraction, and as long as that denominator has a 10 or 100 or 1,000 as a denominator, we're able to read it and use our knowledge of place value to write it. So here I could multiply by 5 and multiply by 5 to give me 15 hundredths. And if I read it as 15 hundredths, it's very easy to write it as a decimal because 15 hundredths is 0.15. And an added bonus to that, because I created an equivalent fraction out of 100, we know that it's 15 hundredths, and since percents are fractions out of 100, the numerator, 15%, describes how much of a percentage it is. Now in the second question, you have 0.002. Now if you read it as 0.002, you will get nowhere with this chapter. You have to read all decimals as if you were reading them with place value. So in this case, the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths. This is 2,000ths, which means it's very easy to write as a fraction. It's 2 over 1,000. And that's it. That's the end of the story. That's a fraction. But if I want to get it as a percentage, I know that I have to have it as an equivalent fraction. out of 100 in order to be able to write that as a decimal. And here we have to follow our rules of multiplication and division by 10. In this case, 1,000 divided by 10. In order to maintain equivalency, I will divide the numerator by 10 as well. When you divide by 10, so when I divide by 10, I simply move the decimal one place to the right, which in this case, if the decimal's here, and I move it one place over here, the equivalent fraction will be 0.2 out of 100. Since percentages are out of 100, that means I have 0.2%. Again, another way you could write that, since it's 0.2%, you could write it like this, or in lowest terms, you could also write it as 1/5%. All three of these, this answer, and this answer, are all the same thing. And finally, your last question says 1/4%. And I think we said this before, but if you have 1/4%, since it's a fraction out of 100, you could technically write it this way, but it really definitely isn't much help to you when you try and make equivalent fractions. So your better starting point is to think of 1/4% as being its decimal counterpoint. So 1/4 is 1/4 is equal to 0.25. So change it to that, in which case your starting point will not be this, but a much more appropriate this. And now I have to create an equivalent fraction that does not have a decimal in the numerator. This time I have to let the decimal move twice, so I have to multiply it by 100, and multiply this by 100. 25 times 100 is 20, or 2,500 times 25, or 100 is 25, excuse me, and 100 times 100 is 10,000. So the equivalent fraction to that would be 25 over 10,000, which is appropriate. And on your test, if you're having a difficult time placing this into place value, what I suggest you do is put some blanks down here, and then read them off as being tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. And since that is what the denominator is, that 25 has to end in the 10,000th position. Place your zeros to maintain its position in the 10,000th position, and you have an answer of 0.0025. And live action. Okay, so now we're on to mentally finding percents of numbers. So all of these questions in red, you should be able to find the percents of the numbers without the use of a calculator. So it's an extension from grade 7. In grade 7, you learned how to do these, and probably these. So the ones in the black box would have been grade 7 work, and the ones that are remaining, the other 4 questions, would be grade 8 variations. But the procedure for them is the same. So 50% is half. So 50% of $164 would be $82. I think that's just a review. 25% is half of half, which would be half of $82, which is $41. 1%, you take your decimal and you move it 2 spots over to give you $1.64. To get 10%, you simply take your decimal and move it 1 spot over to give you $16.40. 5%, if you know what 10% is, 5% is simply half of that, so half of $16.40 is $8.20. And now we're on to the grade 8 version of learning. 1/10%. The rule we have for 1/10% is take your decimal. If you move it 1 spot, that's 10%, 1%, 1/10%. So the answer is 0.164 cents, and that's okay to have a third decimal place because it's 4/10 of a penny, like not quite half a cent, but a little bit less than half a cent. However, because we don't typically use cents in our day-to-day 3 decimal places, you could say approximately equal to 16 cents as well. Both answers would be acceptable. All right. 0.5%. Since 1% is $1.64, I had a very smart student say something like this. You could also say this. Instead of using the dollar sign, you could actually use the cent sign if you wanted, or you go 16 4/10 of a cent. That is appropriate as well, even though we very seldom use the cent sign in actual mathematical circles. Okay, back on track. So 1% is $1.64. So 0.5% is going to be half of $1.64, since half of a percent is half of 1%, which would then be 82 cents. Okay? And now these 2 questions are really questions you would have saw in grade 7, because 35% can be achieved by taking 25% and adding 10% to it. So 25% is $41. 10%, as we already know, is $16 40. So add those together, you would get $56.40, which is what 35% is. Oh, 57? 57, thank you. Thank you, 57.40. That was your point? Thank you. 15% is, of course, going to be the sum of 10% and 5%. 10% we know to be 1640. 5% we know to be 820. So together, you have $24.60. All right, and that would be the sum for 15%. And then the last two, same idea, except this time we're dealing with fractional percents or decimal percents. So 5.1% can be achieved by taking 5% and adding 0.1% to it. 5% we know to be 820. 0.1% we know to be this one here, so plus 16.4 cents, 16 4 cents. Add them together, you get $8.36.4, or approximately $8.36. Both answers are okay. And for the last one in the mental math, 76.5%, you would take 50% plus 25% plus 1% plus 0.5%. And all that together would be 76.5%. 50% is $82. 25% is $41. 1% is $1.64. And 0.5% is 82 cents. Add them all together, you get $123, $124, $125 and 46 cents. Is that right? 125.46. Am I wrong? Am I right? No one's yelling at me, so I guess I'm right. Any questions? Okay, we had you on pause there for a second. There was an exciting exchange between a crow and a mama blue jay outside our window. We just saved some blue jay eggs from being... Yes, I was a hero for sure. I am. But we're right back into this question here, which gives you a table with fractions, decimals, and percents. And the fraction you start with here is 1 2/10. So 1 2/10, if we go back to the very first question, and I'll just scroll up here, and I'll put this one on. So 1 2/10. 1 really represents a full gas tank. So when we talk about 1, we mean a full gas tank. So if I go back to this question, which I bet you I can't find anymore, right here. 1 2/10 would be a full gas tank and 2/10 of a gas tank. But when we want to change them into decimals and percents, the decimals are really easy because we can simply read that as being 1 and 2/10, which is 1 and 2/10. So to change it to a decimal, it's really easy. Just use your place value knowledge. Even though it's greater than 1, it still works. But to get it to a percent, you still have to have the equivalent fraction that has a denominator of 100. And since it's a mixed fraction, what I always encourage you to do is if you want to change it to an equivalent fraction that has a denominator of 100, make it improper first. So 12 over 10 is the improper version of 1 2/10. And the equivalent fraction out of 100 would be 120 out of 100. Then once you have that written like that, so 120 out of 100, since percentages are always fractions out of 100, it's therefore representing 120%. Now the same thing we did with this one, we read this as 1 2/10 and we wrote it as 1 2/10. This one we read as 3 2/100. So we write it as 3 2/100. The exact same thing, just backwards. Now that we have it as a mixed fraction, change it into an improper fraction, which would be 302/100. And when you have it as 302/100, since fractions are out of 100, it would be 302%. And finally, your last question, 10 1/4%. Since it's 10 1/4%, we know percents are out of 100, fractions out of 100, so we could technically write it 10 1/4 out of 100. But we've already established that you definitely can't have fractions in the numerator because it does not work well for what we're about to try to accomplish. So instead of having 1/4, the easiest part to start is just to change it to a decimal. Instead of having 1/4, have decimal 25. Those are the same thing. So 10 decimal 25% is the same thing as 10 1/4%. Here we have to multiply it by 100 to get rid of the decimal because multiplying it by 10 wouldn't be enough. So multiply both top and bottom by 100. 1,025 over 10,000. Place your 0 and your place values. This is the 10,000th position. So 1,025 ends there. And your answer is 0.1025. Back. So the next part says using a calculator, calculate these percents of $82. So in this particular part, when you come to this question on your test, you will receive 2 points. 1 point for showing me the correct buttons you press on the calculator that involve multiplications, and you will get 1 point for the right answer. So it's a 2-point question. The first one is 17.5%. The thinking that has to go into that, of course, 17.5% is 175 over 1,000, excuse me, which is 0.175 as a decimal. So 17.5% of $82 is the same thing as 0.175, which is 17.5%. Of means multiplication, and 82. So on your test, you will receive 1 point for that statement that I've highlighted in yellow. That's the important part to this exercise. And then 1 point if you can press the right buttons. Let me just see here. So it's decimal 175. 17.5% of 82 is $14.35. So 1 point for that as well. In your second question, 105.5% is 105.5 out of 100. That's what percents are, which is 1,055 over 1,000, which is an improper fraction, which is 1 55 thousandths as a mixed fraction. Now that I read that, I know that that is 1 55 thousandths. So 1 55 thousandths is, of $82. That is as a decimal. Of is multiplication. 82. That's worth 1 point. Right there. And your second point comes from pressing the right buttons. Therefore, 105.5% of $87, or $82, excuse me, is $86.51. Is $86.51. Now, the next two questions probably are the trickiest ones, I think, but maybe not. So 3/8% of $82. Well, 3/8%, I don't know what 3/8 is as a decimal, so I got to take my calculator and use that division rule. 3 divided by 8 is 0.375. So therefore, a better starting point, so that's my starting point here. So 3/8% of $82 is the same thing as 0.375% of $82. Since this is a long, convoluted story, that would be what it is as a fraction with a decimal in the numerator. This is what it would be as a fraction without a decimal, because I have to multiply both top and bottom by 1,000 this time. The first time we had to do so because I have to move it 3 times. And 100 times 1,000 is 100,000. And as a decimal, it's 0.00375. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000, 100,000. So therefore, all of this work is for this particular sentence right here, which is worth your 1 point. 3/8% of $82 is 0.00375 times 82, which if we grab our calculator and go decimal 0.00375, or 3/8% of $82, the answer is 0.3075, which is dollars. Another way to say that would be if you did it in Faith's way. Faith said you could think of it as cents, so 30.75 cents, or 30 3/4 cents is another way to think of it, which is kind of cool. Or approximately, which is probably what most people will do, approximately round it to the nearest penny and call it approximately 31 cents. And the last one, 0.2%. If we think about this as a fraction, of course it's going to be this, because percents are out of 100, which is going to be this. So I have to move the decimal 2 places by multiplying it by 100, which is going to be 0.0002, or 2/10,000ths. Okay? And since we're looking for 0.02% of 82, we're going to take this number and multiply it by 82. This will be worth 1 point. And the answer, which is 0.0002 of $82, is approximately 0 decimal, oh, that's a highlighter, $0.0164, or if you want to do it in 1 64 of a cent, or 1.64 cents, not quite 2 cents, or what most of you are probably going to do, approximately 2 cents if you round up. Your second last question gives you a $120 shirt and says you're going to get a $20 discount and then 15% tax. So if we think about this shirt as being this rectangle and it's $120, then percentage-wise, if you have a 20% discount, that means you're going to remove 20% from the cost of it, which means you are going to pay for 80% of the $120 shirt. So what we learned yesterday is if you have a 20% discount, your first step is to say, well, I want to know what 80% of $120 is, or decimal 8 of 120. That's the calculation you need to do for 1 point. Grab your calculator and say, what is 80% of $120? And the calculator will tell you it's 96 bucks. So this is $96, and if you want to think of it a different way, the discount was $24. But we're trying to learn how to do it in just one step. So step 1 is to get $96. And the next part says there's 15% tax. So if I think of this box as being the $96 shirt, that is the 100% of the cost of the shirt now. On to that, I have to add this 15% tax. So in effect, percentage-wise, I have to pay for the shirt and I have to pay for the tax, which means I have to pay for 115% of the $96 shirt. Right? The cost of the shirt and the tax is 115%. 115% is this. So therefore, the calculation that goes into the calculator will be 1.15, or 115% of $96, and we get 110.40, or $110.40 is the final price of the shirt. And your last question, same type of idea, just a little bit different numbers. You have a $28,240 car, which I will temporarily represent by this box. If you are taking a 3.5% discount, that means that's going to be removed, which means you are going to pay for 96.5% of the cost of the car. 96.5% is that decimal. 96.5% of the $28,240 car would be that math. When you work it out with a calculator, 96.5% of the car you have to pay for of the car means that the car will cost you, after your discount, $27,251.60. That is the cost of the car after a 3.5% discount. But then, here's another rectangle. This is going to represent $27,251.60. 100% of the cost of the sale-priced car. And on to that, we have to tack on 10% for tax. So therefore, we're going to pay 110%. 100% is the sale price. 10% is the additional tax. So 110% of the $27,251.60 car is, there it is, I kept it in there, so multiply that by 1.1, and our answer is 299.76. That is the price with tax.